Hey, what's going on YouTube? Welcome back. It's Travis here with JT Wealth. In today's video, we're going to talk all about whether or not $1 million is actually enough to retire on. And we're going to go back and forth with people who have some differing opinions and try to come up with a realistic answer for most people. So let's get into it. Alright guys, thank you so much for checking out today's video. If you don't mind, just take 2 seconds out of your day, smash the like button for me, and consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. And like I said, today we're going to talk about whether or not $1 million is actually enough to retire on. And $1 million is kind of like that unicorn, right? Everybody talks about it as though it were some mystical, majestic end state goal that you can never attain, you can never become a millionaire, and if you do, then you're just set for life, right? Well, the school of thought on this has shifted recently, and now $1 million isn't necessarily what it used to be, thanks mostly in part to inflation and everything costing notably more than it once did. But a quick Google search will show you that just typing in "is $1 million enough to retire" will give you a lot of different options, including Reddit's opinion on the matter, different ages, at whether or not you could retire at 60, 40, 50, even 30 off $1 million, or whether or not it might be beneficial to leave the US and go to someplace like Malaysia or maybe Canada where the dollar goes a little bit further. And you guys have probably seen the 4% rule, whether or not it was from one of my other FIRE videos or other sources out there on social media. But basically the 4% rule says that you can pull 4% from your investments without actually losing the overall value of the investment. And you can do that every single year. And that's kind of how most people start to base the number they need to retire off of. Well, 4% of $1 million would leave you with $40,000 annually to spend as you saw fit. Now, this is probably a good time to stop and mention that when we look at $1 million, you have to determine whether or not you're talking about $1 million in net worth or $1 million invested. And I think for the purposes of today's video, we're actually looking at $1 million invested, because that's what would provide you that $40,000 annually. Just having a net worth of $1 million doesn't necessarily mean that you're liquid for $1 million or that it would actually bring in the returns required for you to live your day-to-day life every year. And now thinking about $40,000 a year, yes, that is in fact more than a lot of people make. But is it more than a lot of people make that live comfortably? That's up to you. You have to start looking at your actual expenses and determine what you spend every year. Then consider items like where you plan on living, what your life expectancy is, and what your actual life expectations are. Do you plan on traveling a lot, living well, living big, or do you plan on living well below your means and just being comfortable? Let's take a look at an unpopular opinion first about how $1 million isn't all it used to be. And like our initial Google search showed, it is straight off of Reddit, and it says $1 million isn't a lot of money anymore. And this person was talking with a friend, and their friend was adamant they could live like a king off $1 million in the US. But he refused to do the math, so says this person, and reasoned that they could pay off their house for about $300,000 and have $28,000 a year left over, assuming that 4% rule for the remaining $700,000. Now his salary was roughly $120,000 a year, so he would have to make drastic changes to his lifestyle to live off that $28,000. The author of the post goes on to say it's a family of 4 and they probably spend about $50,000 a year on their expenses. And he seems to think that his lifestyle would elevate indefinitely should he be able to have that $1 million and stop working. But obviously, if you were to do the math on this one, it's not going to end up being what he thinks, right? Depending on what his debt is looking like and what he intends to do in the future. So even with a paid off house and $28,000 in income from the 4% rule off that $700,000 that remained from his million, if in fact he has $50,000 of annual expenses, he has to now make up for $22,000 that he does not have. So this is where people start to come into some problems. Retiring, in its essence, is about setting yourself up for financial independence and financial success. It's not a numeric value, right? Having $1 million is great, but if you spend $1 million a year, you're broke, right? So the number itself isn't nearly as important as the path and the journey that you took to get there. Determining what your FI number is, knowing that you want to achieve that, limiting your debts, paying off your mortgage, which would be a huge piece to this, and just making sure that whatever you need to spend annually, you have set up in your investments or maybe from an annuity or something like that, especially if you're retiring early and can't count on Social Security. Now let's take a look at another Redditor whose post is almost the exact opposite. And they say I just hit $400,000 net worth and my investments cover my living expenses, and they just wanted to tell somebody. So they kind of posted their list of assets between their house, car, accounts, and they've got at least 3 rental properties in there, and then the 4th property being the one that they're living in currently. They look like they have $168,000 in one investment account, another $10,000 in another one. They got a $21,000 emergency fund, which is fantastic. And after doing the math to pull their liabilities from their assets, it left them with a net worth of $420,000, which, based on their math, believes that they are financially independent because their current annual expenses is only $31,500. But their current rental annual net income alone is $26,400. And again, that's coming from their 3 rental properties. And the 4% rule on their investments, which we saw wasn't that much, maybe $170,000, is $7,120. So cumulatively, between their rental income and their investments, they still have a net at the end of the year of over $2,000 after paying their $31,500 expenses annually. So here's a person who has definitely found a way to live below their means and pull in passive income to pay for their lifestyle. But this isn't just something being discussed on Reddit by millennials and people trying to figure out a way to retire early because they don't necessarily want to run the rat race. This is being discussed by big news outlets too, and has been for years. US News did an article in May of this year that said, can you retire on $1 million and how far it will go? USA Today even put out this post about how long $1 million will last you in retirement. The top 5 states where that dollar will last the longest, and the bottom 5 states where you'll have the least amount of time in retirement. Mississippi seemed to top the list, with Hawaii being the absolute bottom barrel just because of the expenses and how much it costs to live in Hawaii. And obviously, issues like state income tax would come into huge when determining your financial situation in retirement. But on average, it's estimated that in the US, if you have $1 million in an investment account, that account will last you about 20 years. And yes, it does depend on how much you're withdrawing, your tax situation, etc., but that is the average. And it also says that the average American age 65 or older is actually spending $50,000 a year, which you'll note is $10,000 above my 4% rule. Now, $1 million might seem like a lot, but in today's world, it's just not a lot of money anymore. That's not to say it's not a fantastic goal, but what we're saying is you can't be a 25-year-old kid and just retire because you have $1 million today. It really won't last as long as you think. Now, they calculate that retirees need to save an additional $765,000 if they wanted to fund a 35-year retirement. And of course, these are average figures and your personal situation will differ, but there are factors like your housing and your healthcare that are going to seriously impact your budget and determine whether or not that $1 million is enough for you. Now let's take a look at some risk factors that you would want to consider in trying to determine whether or not $1 million is enough for your retirement. Whether you're trying to get to that number or you've just reached it and you need to know whether or not you can sit back and really coast. So factors to consider about is $1 million enough to retire? And how long will that $1 million last in your retirement is going to depend heavily on the following factors. Geography. That means where you live. What's the state income tax there? What's the cost of living? If you're somewhere in California, you're probably going to spend a whole lot more money than somebody in, say, North Carolina or Tennessee. Longevity. Now, are you going to live till the average age of the US male, like 76 years old, the average female, 81 years old? And if you do, how far off is that from when you plan on retiring? Is it 10 years or is it 25 years? These are things to take into consideration, as well as your lifestyle, how much money you plan on spending, how often you need a new vehicle, your healthcare expenses. If you don't have a retirement plan that is paying for your healthcare, this is an out-of-pocket expense that you need to deal with until you hit that Social Security age when you can start utilizing Medicare. Also, your retirement income. Are you receiving a disability paycheck? Are you receiving a pension or an annuity from a company you've worked for and since retired from? Also, your investment risk and inflation are all things to consider. Once you've really taken a close look at that, then you can sit down and determine where exactly you fall in this situation. You take all of your guaranteed income from your investments, any annuity you might have, Social Security if you're of age, and then compare it to what your expenses are going to be based on your lifestyle, location, and etc. If you have a gap there, that's where you have to determine where you're going to make up that gap, if at all. Are you going to get a part-time job, or possibly do you need to work another year or two to save the amount necessary to retire comfortably? Now, you all know I am a huge proponent of FIRE, and I love getting people excited and motivated to talk about financial independence and work towards achieving it. But we have to be realistic when creating our goals, which means looking at the dark side of things and thinking, hey, $1 million is a fantastic amount of money, but if I don't change my lifestyle first and get my spending habits under control, have a solid budget, and plan accordingly, you could go through any amount of money way too fast. It just depends on how you utilize that money, right? Most people think, hey, if I just had more money, I'd be rich. That's not often the case. Look at professional athletes or anybody who's won the lottery lately. They end up being broke soon after getting the money, not because they didn't have enough money, but because they don't have the financial independence and financial knowledge necessary to actually utilize that money to make them more money. Instead, they're just spending it willy-nilly. I just wanted to say willy-nilly. So hopefully today's video gives you a better idea of where exactly your financial situation would be should you actually achieve that milestone goal of an investment account of about $1 million. Make sure you're doing the math. Know where you sit with your budget, your assets versus your liabilities, and how much you really need to retire comfortably. Thank you so much for checking out today's video, guys. If you liked the video, give me a big thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel. And until next time, bottoms up.